This is the SMSL DO200. It's a $489 DAC. On paper, it looks very similar to other SMSL and topping products. And so the questions we're no doubt all asking is whether it's better than something like the SU8S, which is cheaper, and whether it can be nearly as good or even better perhaps than something like the topping D90SE. Let's explore. Welcome to Passion for Sound, the channel dedicated to thorough and honest reviews of headphones, earphones, DACs, headphone amps, other components and accessories. Basically everything audio related except power amps and passive speakers. My name's Lachlan and my goal is to explore and discuss all kinds of audio topics, even the controversial ones, to help us all find more enjoyment from music. Thanks for watching and enjoy the video. Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. Before we get into the review today, I just want to raise what I hope will be a fantastic opportunity for you and for the channel. As I record this, we're currently sitting at about 16,500 subscribers, which is fantastic, but it's a very, very slow climb for a small channel like mine. To help that along, I'd like to ask a small favor from each of you, and I have this stack in front of me as an incentive to say thank you for doing it. What I have planned is that I have a goal to reach 20,000 subscribers, and at the point that we reach 20,000 subscribers here on Passion for Sound, I'm going to give away this stack here in front of me. So that's an SMSL SU8S and an SMSL SH8S. This is a fantastic stack. I've reviewed it here on the channel. I think it's fantastic. It compares really favorably to everything else in the price range. And so I'm going to give away this $600 stack to a subscriber to the channel once we reach 20,000 subscribers. What I need you to do is find your favorite reviews on the channel, whichever ones they might be, and share them wherever you can. Social media, whether it's Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, whichever social media you like, or on your favorite audio forums. It doesn't matter where you share it. The key is to get the channel in front of as many people as possible and see if we can get that number to 20,000. If you can help me get there, you then have a chance to win this SMSL stack here in front of me. So please do help share the channel around. I've got what I think is some great content coming down the pipeline. Things like the ZMF Verite Open, the Hollow May and Spring KTE versions, the Shit Yggdrasil OG version. I've got what I think are some great reviews. So share any reviews that you like, share them as widely as you can, and let's see if we can get to 20,000 subscribers so I can give away this stack, hopefully to you. In terms of details for the giveaway, we'll get to that when we get to 20,000. So for now, please just share as much as you can, get the word out there about the channel, and hopefully we'll hit 20,000 nice and soon. With that out of the way, let's put aside this SMSL stack and start talking about this one. In particular, I'm going to talk about the DAC here. I've already reviewed the HO200. The reason I've got it on my desk is not that I'm going to go into depth on it in this review. I'm going to only talk about the DO200, but I did want to show you what a great looking stack this is. To me, this is one of the nicer looking stacks I've come across from the topping and SMSL range. I've really enjoyed having it on my desk. So as much as the HO200 for me is just an average, good, solid amplifier, but not setting the world on fire, it's been a really nice stack. And I'll explain now why by talking about the DO200.
Your heart, keep it in your pocket for safekeeping. Don't ever let nobody be the reason you throw it out, you stop caring about it. Don't let your hair get in the way. Can't be defined.
As a starting point, I'd like to say a huge thank you to Ayashida Audio for sending me the DO200 for review. And as always, I'll put a link down below where you can click through to Ayashida, buy from them as a way of saying thank you for making this review possible. There's no affiliates or kickbacks, it's just a thank you. The DO200 here is built on the back of a couple of ES9068AS DAC chips. Now if you've watched the channel much, you'll know that I don't put a huge amount of value into which chip is which, but I do like to share it with you just in case you want to know. As I'll talk about soon, every single Delta Sigma DAC chip has a fairly similar presentation with slight differences. And so for me, it's not really important whether it's a 9068, whether it's an AKM, whether it's a different model from Sabre. It doesn't really make a big difference, but we'll get to that in more detail shortly. First, let's talk about some other key features of the DO200. This is a fully MQA capable DAC, so if you're interested in MQA, if you're streaming Tidal a lot, this could be a really good choice. It'll handle MQA through the USB, but actually through all of the other sockets as well. So whether it's the SPDIF, the optical, the I2S, it'll take MQA from whatever source is delivering it. While we're talking about inputs and outputs, let's have a quick look at the back of the unit. As you can see when you look at the back here, there's nothing too standout. We've got the power switch over on the side and the power socket. You've then got your USB and your optical, the SPDIF input for coaxial. You've got an antenna socket here for Bluetooth, I2S underneath, and then an AES EBU socket. So you've got all different sorts of digital inputs taken care of there. There's really nothing this isn't going to connect to. Moving further over here, we've then got a pair of XLR outputs and a pair of RCA outputs. So nothing too unusual. It's a fairly standard setup, but it's got everything you could ever need. Add to that the fact that this is also preamp capable, and you've got yourself potentially an all-in-one should you be wanting to run things like active speakers only. As a preamp, I'm just going to say it runs really well, as you'd expect from most of these DAC preamp combos. There's nothing specifically interesting to say about it, and so everything I say in the sound quality section, which was done testing with headphones, that holds true for speakers as well. Looking at the front of the DAC, things are very, very simple. We've got a display screen there that you can see and a control knob, and that's it. So the control knob here doubles for both a volume control if you're using it in preamp mode, but it's also your selector for moving through the menu system as you're getting the device set up. All in all, it's all very simple to use, nothing fancy. It's the same sort of screen as we've seen on multiple SMSL devices. It's a decent enough interface. I've had no problems with it, and I do like the fact that it shows me clearly and easily what's going on the device. I can see the input being used, the sample rate that it's running at. It shows the high res logo if you're listening to a high sample rate input source. So there's lots of nice information there, but it's not over the top and flashy or anything like that. And beyond that, there's really not a lot to talk about with the DO200 other than getting into its sound. There are a few other settings in there, in things like the filter settings for the DAC, the sound color mode, which I will talk about shortly. There are also options with things like the dimmer, changing how the outputs on the back work, setting up which version of I2S pinout you're using. So there's configuration type stuff in there, but I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on those because it's pretty standard stuff that you can read about in a manual. Where I think I can provide more value to you is in talking about the sound of the DO200. And that brings us back around to what I said before about most Delta Sigma chips sounding pretty similar. Some people might tell you that every single DAC that measures the same sounds the same, and I don't agree with that at all, having listened to so many different DACs over the years. However, I do agree that the differences, particularly when you're talking one Delta Sigma to the next, the differences are very, very small. To get significant differences between the sound of DACs, you generally have to go from something like a Delta Sigma DAC over to something like an R2R or a multi-bit from SHIT or something like a Chord DAC that does Delta Sigma in a different way. Now, if you're not familiar with the term Delta Sigma, that's just a processing style that most DACs on the market use. I'm not going to go into depth on it here. You can look it up online. All you need to know is it's just a way of processing the signal, and it's what the vast majority of DACs on the market are using. Anything using a chip from ESS, so the Sabre chips, from AKM, from Cirrus Logic, they're all using what's called a Delta Sigma approach. And so all of the DACs that use those sorts of chips from those sorts of brands will generally have a pretty similar sound with some subtle variations. And those variations generally come from things like different chips doing the processing a little bit differently. It can come from the way the power management is arranged, so the power supply within the DAC itself is very important, and also the output stage of the DAC. And that's why it's really important, in my mind at least, that when deciding on a DAC, you understand how it compares to others, rather than hearing just a description of an individual DAC in its standalone state. If I was going to tell you what the DO200 sounded like based on listening only to that, I'd say it sounded clean, smooth, detailed, transparent. That's pretty much what I'd say for every other DAC that comes across my desk if it's a Delta Sigma design. I'd also tell you that it has a decent width in soundstage, but not a great deal of depth. And if you go back and look at any other review I've done on a Delta Sigma DAC, I'd say exactly the same thing. So does that mean that the DO200 is no different from other DACs? Definitely not, and I'm going to explain that now. You see, what tends to improve and change as you go up the range in DACs and spend a bit more money in most cases, not all cases, but most cases, is you start to get a better sense of refinement in the sound. You might get better control and clarity in the treble and the ability of the DAC to reproduce transients. Those are things like guitar plucks, hits on a snare or a cymbal, those leading edges of notes, the first part of a note that hits your ears. That's where higher level DACs, better designed DACs, will generally do better. And so rather than go into any more depth on the DO200 in isolation, I want to extend the sound quality conversation here by comparing it to a couple of other DACs. Before I do that though, I do want to cover off the sound color modes on this, because they do make a subtle but noticeable difference to the sound. I'm not entirely sure how the sound color is being processed here, because this is all operating in the digital domain, so it's obviously somehow adding harmonics, or it's adding some very subtle frequency boosting, I'm not entirely sure. But the DO200 offers you 3 sound color modes, or technically 9, because each of the 3 has 3 levels. So you've got Rich 1, 2, 3. You've got Tube 1, 2, 3, and you've got Crystal 1, 2, 3. For each mode, the higher the number, the more of the impact it has on the sound. So Rich number 1 has lower impact on the sound than Rich number 3. And what each of those different descriptors means, Rich, Tube, and Crystal, they're referring, to my ears at least, to the area of the sound frequency that is being affected. So when you go through the rich color modes, you're going to get a little bit of bass boost in the sound. It's very, very subtle. It's not like you're turning on a bass boost switch. It's just a little bit of extra presence down low. If you go to the tube options, you're going to get a bit of extra mid-range weight. Again, not major. It's just a very, very subtle change, but it does bring a bit of extra presence and richness to the mids. Finally, Crystal, as the name might suggest, does the same thing to treble. It's not overly aggressive, it's pretty subtle, but it does seem to make a difference. And I like that. I think it's good that you can just bring a little tiny bit of colour to the sound. Let's say you've got an amp or a headphone, your overall sound chain needs a bit of extra warmth in the mids, or richness in the bass, or sparkle in the treble. I like the fact you can do that from the DO200 without having to go too far down the path of EQing or worrying about other devices you might need to buy and swap out in your system. You can just give it a tiny tweak with the DO200. I do really like that. It's not a feature I personally tend to use, but I like that it's there. And so now, to give you a much better sense of how the DO200 sounds with none of that sound coloration applied, let me compare it for you to the SMSL DO200 and then the topping D90SE. Starting off with the cheaper SMSL DO200, which is a DAC that I quite like. In its price range, it's around about that $360 mark. The DO200 shares a lot in common with that DAC. And that's a good thing. It's a nice DAC, the DO200, and the DO200 just takes what the DO200 does and does it all a little bit better, as you'd expect when you're spending a bit more money. The most obvious change going from the DO200 to the DO200 is a slightly more open and spacious sound. So tonally they're very similar, but the DO200 opens the space up a bit. One of my test tracks while I was doing this comparison was Clean by Ryan Adams. And what I found when listening to that, going between the DO200 and the DO200, was that there are guitars, acoustic guitars being strummed on both the left and the right in that recording, and the DO200 pushes them a little bit further out to the side and creates a better sense of space for the vocals in the center of the soundstage. I also felt like the DO200 made everything a little bit smoother in all of the right ways. So it wasn't at a cost of any texture or detail or anything like that, but it just made everything a little bit more refined overall. There's no doubt that some people on first listen will probably perceive the DO200 as being a little bit more detailed and textured and clear, but I think what's actually going on there is it's adding a bit of artificial sense of clarity because it's a slightly harsher sound. To me, going back and forth between the two, the DO200 for me sounds more analog. Now that's a funny kind of term when we're talking about digital. What I mean by analog is it's closer to what you'd expect listening to something like vinyl, where things sound smooth and clean and natural and less digitized, less harsh, less grainy. As I said, analog's not a great term, but I think it sums up here what I was hearing, which is that the DO200 just comes across more refined, smoother, and overall, to me at least, it sounds better. So having listened to both of these at length, I would personally definitely recommend the DO200 over the DO200. The DO200 is fantastic, but the DO200 just does everything it does a little bit better, and it gives you extra input options. So you've now got I2S, AES or EBU, it just gives you more versatility across the board and slightly better sound as well. And so, as is often the case when I'm doing reviews like this, that then makes me wonder, just how good is this? It's a nice step above a cheaper model, so is it as good as a step up to a higher priced model? And on this occasion, what I had here was the topping D90SE DAC. Now the D90SE is a significantly more expensive DAC. It should theoretically wipe the floor with the DO200. And so I was really impressed to hear the DO200 go toe-to-toe with the D90SE. One of the tracks I used when comparing the two was The Climb by Stan Walker. Stan Walker's an Aussie musician. This is a cover of the Miley Cyrus track, The Climb. And in listening to this, flicking between the two, I'd have to say the differences between the DO200 and the D90SE were almost indistinguishable, if not indistinguishable, in general terms. There are some things that separate the two, but I wouldn't say that one is clearly a step above or below the other from a technical perspective. What did separate the two though was their tonal character. The D90SE has a slightly brighter character to its treble, and it can get a little bit brittle up top sometimes. Whereas I found the DO200 maintained a smoothness much like what I described with the SU8S, a smoothness without any loss of texture or detail in the top end. During the chorus of The Climb, there's some hi-hat work from the drum kit, and from the D90SE, I felt like it was slightly over-enhanced, it was over-emphasized in the mix, whereas the DO200, for me, had it better balanced with the rest of the sound. If you had a bright setup to start with, maybe you've got a pair of HT800s or DT1990s for instance, I think the D90SE would push things too far. Whereas the DO200 is going to work well across all sorts of systems because to me at least, I think it's a more natural and neutral sounding DAC. We're talking subtleties here, but at this point, it's the subtleties that define and separate these sorts of products. One area where some people are going to prefer the D90SE is because of that slight sense of treble emphasis that it brings. It is going to give you a better sense of breathiness and air in vocals and instrumentation. You're going to get more of that from the D90SE. Whereas in comparison, the DO200 sounds just a little bit richer. Now it doesn't sound overly rich or overly thick, just comparatively richer than the D90SE, which is quite airy and textured up top. That's an area where I wouldn't say one is better than the other, they're just different. So in terms of the treble, I do think the DO200 has better treble than the D90SE, but in terms of that air and that texture, that's more of a preferential one. And so this got me to thinking about the stacks once again. Kind of back to where we started this, talking about the DO200 and the HO200, and it had me really wishing that I had an A90 here to pair with the D90SE, because I have a feeling that the combination of these two might be my preference over and above the D90SE and the A90. I have a sense that the A90 might be a better amp than the HO200, even though I've never compared the two, but I love the compact design of the DO and HO200. I actually like the look of them better as well. I like the display on the DO200 better, and so I do think I would probably lean towards these two if I had the A90 D90 stack to compare directly. Of course, if there was a vast sonic difference, I would still go for the one that sounded better, but I do have a real soft spot for this particular stack. A couple of final things I should mention before I sign this off and give you a final conclusion is that I did my normal testing of using both the XLR and RCA outs, as well as a few different inputs to the DO200, and I'm pleased to report that everything I've just said is totally transferable regardless of which inputs or outputs you're using. Of course, the use of different cables may alter the sound slightly, but if you're able to use exactly the same cables across the different inputs and outputs, you're going to hear essentially the same sound. And that's great because it means it's a highly versatile DAC. You don't have to worry about running it balanced into one product and then singling it into another and having a different experience. You're going to get the same sounds. Likewise, if you want to use it for USB sometimes, and maybe you've got a streamer that outputs I2S at other times, you're still going to enjoy roughly the same performance from both. And so with that said, I want to summarize things and close this off by saying I think the DO200 is an absolute bargain of a DAC. As I said, I would personally buy this over and above the D90SE, which is a more expensive DAC. It's also bigger, and it doesn't offer a huge amount of functionality over and above the DO200. In fact, I think the only thing it offers is the ability to separate and switch off the RCA and XLR outputs, whereas with the DO200, it's constantly running both. So unless that's a really big deal for you, I don't see a lot of reasons to choose the D90SE. You can save yourself some dollars, get yourself a great compact DAC that performs really well. So I'd like to say thank you once again to Ayashida Audio for sending out the DO200, introducing me to this range. I wasn't particularly familiar with the DO and HO200 range until these arrived. So thank you Ayashida for sending them out. Do remember to use the link down below through to Ayashida if you're thinking about purchasing this one as a way of saying thank you to them for sharing it with me so I could share it with you. And speaking of sharing, don't forget about the challenge to get Passion for Sound up to 20,000 subscribers. Please think about your favorite video, share it anywhere and everywhere you can, and hopefully very soon I'll be announcing the giveaway terms for the SMSL SU8S and SH8S stack. But for now, I'll leave it to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.